All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Evaluation Failures, Case Studies for Teaching and Learning with Kylie Hutchinson, Jane Davidson, and Benoit Gauthier. This webinar is presented as part of our Sage Talk series, connecting you to influential authors one webinar at a time. Now, before we begin, we have a quick poll we'd like you to take. You should see that in just a second on the screen in front of you. Our question for you today is, what is your primary role in evaluation? I'll give you just a minute to answer. I have a feeling I know what the answer is going to be based on who registered. The answers you provided then. This kind of information is always really great so that we can get to know our audience as we go into the presentation. I'll give you another second to answer, close it out. Alrighty. So it looks like we've got heavily practitioner-oriented audience here with us today. To be expected. Got a few instructors, a few students. This kind of information is always really helpful to know as we go into the presentation. Thanks so much for answering today. Well, I am pleased to introduce our speakers today. Kylie Hutchinson has a Bachelor of Science in Health Studies from the University of Waterloo and 20 years experience consulting in evaluation and program sustainability planning with community solutions. She is the author of 3 books for evaluators and nonprofits. Kylie's passion is designing practical tools and resources for evaluators working in the trenches. Benoit Gauthier spent 30 years conducting evaluations, mostly as a consultant, but also as a public servant, and is now more involved in teaching evaluation at the Quebec National School of Public Administration and at Carleton University in Ottawa. He's an honorary fellow of the Northern Institute of Charles Darwin University in Australia, as well as an associate researcher at the Canada Research Chair in Program Evaluation. Dr. Jane Davidson is a speaker, author, evaluation coach, and presenter best known for pioneering the increasingly popular evaluation rubrics methodology, along with her various other refreshingly practical evaluation frameworks and approaches. Jane is former Associate Director of the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University, where she launched and directed the world's first fully interdisciplinary PhD in evaluation. Now, all 3 of these folks are contributors to the new book, Evaluation Failures, 22 Tales of Mistakes Made and Lessons Learned, published by Sage. Today's webinar will run about an hour and will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We'll be sending out a link to view that recording in the coming weeks. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. After the presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A, so please also use that Q&A box to ask any questions to our speakers throughout the webinar. Now also, we have the hashtag SageTalks. Feel free to ask questions and have conversations on Twitter. In today's discussion, our speakers will share their real-life evaluation blunders and ways to incorporate their lessons learned into the classroom or personal practice. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome our speakers.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Hi. Kylie, it said that about 20 minutes ago, it doesn't have to be slick, you know, failures abound in every way, so this is an example. And I guess I'm kind of happy to be here today and to tell you my story of a failure. Not something that most people like to do, but, you know, we've discovered in the whole team of 22 authors in that book that was referenced earlier that talking about our own failures, thinking about our own failures is an important way to learn and grow. So I'm going to start from the beginning and tell you that I started in evaluation in 1984, and that is important to my story because in 1984, the evaluation wasn't what it is now. Evaluation actually did not exist. There were no such things as evaluators in 1984, at least in Canada, in my area of the world. There were psychologists and political scientists like me and sociologists and so on who happened to dabble in this new thing called program evaluation. So there was limited enculturation into what we call now evaluation, and the first few years that anyone spends doing something really creates them as a professional. So I am an accidental evaluator. I'm very much involved in the volunteer and collective action world of evaluation through the Canadian Evaluation Society, the International Organization for Cooperation and Evaluation, Eval Partners, and the Réseau Francophone de l'Évaluation, all because I care about evaluation. And because I care about evaluation, I want to tell you about this mistake that I made so that you can avoid making it yourself. In 1984, when I was brought to the profession, evaluation was essentially the application of social science methods to estimating incremental impacts of programs. And that has stayed with me for a long time, 20 plus years, as this is what evaluators do. So this is the tale of a particular case where this organization was evaluating one of its very long-standing programs, decades worth of programming, all around the same approach to the issue that they were tackling. In this case, this program had two levels of assistance and benefits that it was offering to the beneficiaries. So we counted on three types of individuals into the program design. Those in group one that had the most benefits and supposedly the most results. Those in groups two that had reduced benefits but still some results in theory. And those in group three who did not receive benefits and therefore for whom we weren't expecting results as measured through the evaluation. So this program was based on three groups with three levels of benefits. The evaluation was also very heavily involved in quantitative analysis, and that's because of my own predisposition for quantitative analysis, given my upbringing in evaluation and in social science. We had a very substantial survey data set gathered from thousands of participants and non-participants, and we're using this quasi-experimental design with one treatment group and two control groups, as I explained on the previous slides. We had a very substantial, again, complete measurement model because there was a lot of literature on the topic we're studying, and because we were afraid that the primary group, the group number one receiving the most benefit, would also be biased in a positive manner towards the outcomes. So we were using multivariate techniques, statistical approaches, and so on to build very sophisticated multivariate models of incremental impacts, and that led to this. Led to this. The work program does not work. That's the conclusion of this very quantitative and sophisticated evaluation. The program doesn't work. There's no difference in expected outcomes amongst the different groups, even though the qualitative evidence led to a different conclusion. But then again, isn't it always the case that the qualitative evidence, the interviews, lead to a more positive result than the quantitative interviews? At least that's what I thought at the time. So in the end, the result of this evaluation was that we went back to the program managers saying, this program that you've been running for decades, it doesn't work. The problem, though, is that the evaluation manager from the start had expressed some concerns that we were not understanding the program correctly. But the manager was not very explicit in his comments. We told the manager several times, we're following the evaluation design, we are aligned to the logic models, how could we go wrong? We are doing everything right. Well, we could go wrong, and the reason we were going wrong, and I should say I was going wrong because I was very much in the lead in this evaluation, was that I did not take into account the context. I learned after the fact that the different pools of beneficiaries were not independent from one another, that they were all immersed in the same system really, and that they were not isolated, that the fate of one group had an impact on the fate of the other. And had I been more attentive to the qualitative evidence and probably more open to the inputs, the fragile inputs that I was given by particularly by the evaluation manager, who was not articulating his point very clearly, I would have been more in tune with this situation, and I would have been able to attack the situation differently. The problem is I was not in tune, and I was not informed, and I did not look beyond the logic model to think in more systemic terms about where is this intervention taking place. So the takeaways really from this failure to understand, note that the evaluation said program doesn't work, and the first decision of the government was to actually increase the budget for the same program, showing that we were not very credible in our results. The first lesson learned was listen, listen, listen. I could have avoided this error if I had listened more intently to the program and evaluation stakeholders. Secondly is to recognize diversity, that even if things appear to be monolithic, in real life they aren't. And that not every beneficiary group reacts the same way as other beneficiary group, and they all have to be recognized for who they are. Thirdly, and to me probably most importantly, logic models, they're good, but they're very limited. Logic models are, they're program-centric, and therefore they tend to put the evaluator at risk of remaining program-centered as well. Be a realist is my fourth point. Consider all the evidence, consider the qualitative and the contextual evidence in particular. Make sure to not limit yourself to what seems to be both measurable and evident in the situation. Communicate, and again, communicate. I mentioned it earlier, paying more attention to what I was being told by the internal evaluation manager, even if not perfectly articulated, would have made this evaluation a lot better. And finally, work on your own impressions. We all need to evolve because evaluation evolves, because the quality of evaluation today may not be the quality of evaluations tomorrow, basically. This chapter in the book ends on 3 questions. Each chapter ends on 3 questions so that people can think beyond the presentation. And my 3 questions have to do with how do as evaluators can we make sure to understand program results, even beyond the logic model. Secondly, how can we better articulate the concerns of stakeholders, even if they don't master our lingo and our concepts? And thirdly, how do we avoid becoming rigid in our practice? Being experienced is good, but if experience means being rigid, that is not so positive. So this is it for me, and I suspect we're going to go to Kylie now.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Benoit. That was terrific.
Okay, there we go. All right, so today I'm going to tell you about a story that at the time just felt like a huge failure, but over time it became a really important and critical piece of learning for myself. Advance. There we go. So in British Columbia, which is the province where I live, about 25% of our family physicians are slated to retire over the next 5 years. And you can imagine this is cause for real concern and action because BC is a very large province with a lot of rural and remote areas. Advanced. So But finding and keeping these new doctors is hard. So this is Dease Lake. It's in the far north of the province, and you can see there's not much there. It's hard to attract and retain a doctor and their family in communities like these for a multitude of reasons. So I used to provide evaluation support to a provincial physician recruitment and retention steering committee that was formed to address this problem. And the longer I sat at this table, the more complicated I realized that this issue was. And I really wanted to find a way to somehow demonstrate the complexity of this to the members of this committee. And Suzanne, if you're finding the slides are advancing automatically, that's another failure of mine, so just flip them back.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. That is what's happening.
Yeah.
But it's fine.
Yeah. I gave this as an Ignite before. So, okay, so it's a super, super complex issue. So advance. I wanted to somehow communicate the complexity of this to the members of this recruitment and retention steering committee to help them think more strategically about the issue, but also to better define the boundaries of the evaluation. And systems thinking is a fairly new issue that evaluators were trying to, if you want to go back, that we're trying to grapple with. So I automatically thought of a systems map, and systems maps are common tools used to visualize complexity. Okay, cue the slide. Advance. So I spent a couple of days at my desk developing this one. It's actually a causal loop map, and I have to tell you, I had a lot of fun putting this map together. I was pulling in all of the elements that impact physician recruitment and retention. And I really have to say, if you want to go, yeah, I really have to say that I was feeling quite smug about what I had produced at the end. I was feeling very, very proud of it. Advance. So I put all of the barriers to physician recruitment and retention in red, and I put all the enablers in blue. And as I was doing this, the insights and the leverage points and the strategy was literally jumping off the screen at me. And to me, it was so simple where the committee needed to intervene. It was incredibly simple. Advance. And I had this idea that, like the movie Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come, right? Or if I showed my committee this map, then they would have insights, derive conclusions, suggest recommendations, and we'd also have a really fairly clear boundary for the evaluation. So I printed it on 11 by 17 paper, put it as a placemat at each member's seat, and when it came time to present, this is what I got, right? I gazed around the room expecting, you know, deep and meaningful conversation, and these are the looks that I got. You can go back, Suzanne. So I heard things like, it's kind of overwhelming, Kylie. And one manager, who I know is quite sharp, just looked at me point blank and said, I don't get it. And then they actually asked me if I could put it into a table format. And I thought, oh, God. So, yep, this is good. So I tried enlarging it as a poster, as you see here on the screen, and I brought it to the next meeting because I thought, well, maybe if I made it bigger, then they could see its true genius. But they still didn't use it, and now it's just sitting on the wall in my office, and it kind of haunts me daily. So then, in 2017, I participated in the Systems Evaluation TIGS Unconference. This was a virtual conference. And I went into a breakout group on tools and strategies for systems visualization. And I told my story, and one person in the breakout group said this, and you can advance. They said, maybe systems maps are a better investigative tool than a communications tool. And I thought, wow, I think you might be right. Maybe my original idea of a systems map was totally wrong. So you can advance. So could you understand something like this if you weren't there to develop it? Or would you actually take the time to, you know, sort out the connections and figure it out by yourself? If somebody gave it to you at a meeting to discuss, maybe even if they put it on a nice placemat, advance. Or what about this, right? So when I look at something like this, my brain just shuts off, right? I think this was helpful for one person and one person only, right? My brain just goes, I think it was helpful with one person, and that's the person who developed it, right? So there were some major lessons that I learned from this mistake. So first, I realized it's the practice of thinking through the complexity myself and identifying the different connections and leverage points and barriers that made the strategy so obvious for me to see. It's the process, not the product. I realized it was the process, not the product. Advance. So my other key lesson was don't do these things alone. And of course, you know, I should know this because engaging stakeholders is one of our prime directives as evaluators, right? Doing things like this together help people better understand what's going on in the system, identifying those root problems, and coming to consensus around what the borders of the evaluation or the boundaries of the evaluation should be. Advance. So this made me recall something that a fellow called Richard Beckhardt said back in the 80s, and it has since become one of my biggest mantras in evaluation. People support what they helped create. It makes sense. Advance. So now I can't wait for another opportunity to have a second try at developing a systems map, but this time with a group of stakeholders, not for them. And this time I'm going to try something similar but slightly different called a rich picture. And here's a rich picture on the screen now. Most people can absorb more from a picture of a complex subject than from straight text. And some of the benefits of using a rich picture is they integrate different perspectives into one picture. And you can be very explicit about showing things like conflict or emotions and politics. And this is a really important learning for me as well. These maps, they don't have to be slick. They just have to be meaningful for the people and useful. So that was my learning. We can advance. So if I was using this as a case study in the classroom, these are some of the questions that I might put as discussion questions for everybody. So that was my chapter in the book and my little failure, Lost Without You, and learning about engaging stakeholders. So now what I'd like to do is pass it on to our last speaker today, which is Jane Davidson, who hopefully will not experience the challenges that I just did. And Jane has another killer story for you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Kylie. All right, Jane, over to you.
So this is the sorry tale of a scope creep train wreck, which I sincerely hope all of my colleagues out there in evaluation world never ever have to experience. But guess what? You might. So buckle up, folks. Oops. Kia ora. My name's Jane Davidson. I'm originally from New Zealand. I'm now based in sunny Seattle. It's actually sunny today, just saying. I've spent the last couple of decades working as an external evaluator, but spent a few years prior to that doing internal evaluation. These days I focus mostly on building evaluation capacity through coaching and workshops and online learning. So, and I also help create evaluation and monitoring frameworks and tools that help organizations drive and track change. Going on. I'll just get that webcam off so it's not in the way. So this is a story from very early in my consulting career of how scope creep can creep up on you. Oh boy, did I learn some lessons from this one. This was a 2-year evaluation of a professional development program for federal government employees. It was a combination formative and summative evaluation. It was designed to find out how worthwhile the program was as an investment of taxpayer money and people's time and effort, and to identify the places where it could be strengthened. The paying client in this case was a government agency, but there were many stakeholders involved, as you can see. Now, I wasn't quite this young and foolish at the time. I can hear you all laughing, but in hindsight, my first mistake was that I did this evaluation solo, not as part of a team, but for good reasons. You know, it was very early on in my career. I felt like I really needed a home run with a decent-sized project that I could say I'd done myself and not being carried by someone more experienced. I didn't feel like I was biting off more than I could chew. In fact, it seemed like the perfect project to provide a solid base of contract work over the next couple of years. So I was actually pretty excited about this evaluation. So it was a professional learning program. So I had a background in training and development. My doctorate was in organizational psychology. So this was right up my intellectual alley. Plus, I had a fantastic project manager I was working with internally. So the project was looking pretty good as far as I could see. But then all the wheels started to come off, not in a sudden or catastrophic way, but little by little, and it all added up. To give you an idea of the sequence of events. So the first thing that happened was that the CEO of the agency that I had commissioned this evaluation resigned, and we ended up with a second CEO. What happens when you change CEOs in pretty much any organization? Yep, they love to redraw the lines and boxes to make it look like their signature organization. So there was a big restructure. As a result of that restructure, of course, restructures often make people very unhappy. My delightful, wonderful project manager left, and I ended up with a second project manager. So I'm now working with someone who doesn't know much about the evaluation, and the kicker was that that project manager's manager had also left. So it was like 2 levels of people who had gone. Then, to throw a complete cat amongst the pigeons, it was an election year and we had a change of government. So now we had a new minister and there were new policies and new priorities. So once again, to reflect the new priorities of the new incoming government, we had another agency restructure. Can you believe it? I mean, this was like probably less than a year since we had the last one. It was completely insane. What happens when you restructure organizations? People bail. So there goes my second project manager. I've got project manager number 3, who knows even less about the project than the previous one. So I'm having to get this project manager up to speed, try and get them clued in and bought into the evaluation. Next thing you know, the second CEO resigns. So now we've got a third CEO. Oh my God. What do the CEOs do when they come in? That's right, they restructure. What happens when you restructure? People bail. I'm now into my 4th project manager. Can you believe this? It was completely insane. I tried to be responsive to all these changes, but the project scope and timeline just crept more and more, and I ended up way over the deadline and out of budget. By the time I seriously started to freak out, I was in deep, very deep. Did I do anything right in here? At the time it didn't seem so, but one thing I did almost instinctively was to build in a lot of real-time updates of my findings so that the key decision makers weren't waiting on one final report but had some insights at their fingertips they were able to use immediately to make changes or inform thinking. So that was the good news. The bad news was the looming deadline for the big final report. I had used up a lot of time on the additional meetings, making changes, and those more useful real-time updates. But at the same time, I was nervous about ruining my reputation by flaking on the final hurdle and not completing the report as I'd agreed to. In the end, I decided it was best to just honor the commitment and write a decent report, even if it ate up many more hours and took longer. My future was more important than the now. Well, what did we learn from this, my fellow evaluators? First of all, curveballs will come. The vast majority of the challenges I faced were well outside my control, but they are quite common. Hopefully not that many of the same kind of things, but all of us, self-employed or internal, can expect curveballs like this at least every couple of years. And not just curveballs relating to the project, but also unforeseen personal circumstances. I've had all sorts of things happen in my life. Life happens, and when you're self-employed, there's no sick leave allotment to draw on, so it can get pretty dicey. These days, I try and work in some preventative measures like these. So first, I build in more frequent checkpoints into every evaluation. I also discuss with the client having at least a 10% budget contingency just in case of scope creep. I can't always pull this off, but when I'm dealing with experienced clients, they generally see the sense in it. Timeline buffers, there are often very strong pressures from clients when you're writing the proposal to keep the budget down, so you end up I think, underestimating how long something is going to take because you're imagining it's going to be a best case scenario. Inserting a few worst case scenario buffers into the timeline is realistic and responsible. And once again, savvy clients really appreciate this. It's all part of my general philosophy to under-promise and over-deliver rather than the other way around. It's a pretty good life philosophy, actually. The other thing was shorter projects. The shorter the project time span, the less risk there is of scope creep. So if you can't get a contingency budget or contingency timeline, maybe push instead for doing the project in small chunks. I know that gives less financial certainty due to the short timelines, and there's the option for clients to change their minds on whether they want you to do the whole thing, but on the flip side, it is much less stressful. More importantly, if things really shift, as the evaluator, I end up not locked into an evaluation that the client organization no longer wants. Another big lesson from me is don't go it alone. Like contracting solo on a large project is like a huge high-stakes bet on yourself and your invincibility. The best way to, go back to that. The best way to hedge your bets, collaborate with some trusted colleagues like these lovely people, some of my favorite evaluators on this earth. If you're like me, working with others helps you sweep along with productivity and motivation as well. So there's another plus. And sometimes they'll need some help on projects too. And so it ends up working both ways. The paper trail. Work from the assumption that your dream project manager is likely to be replaced at some point during the evaluation. Like any decent sized project, this pretty much always happens to me. It happened on a recent project. So really important to keep a paper trail that details any agreements you've made about changes to the scope and focus of the evaluation. That way, when the next project manager comes in, you can bring them up to speed with a succinct written summary of changes that have already been agreed to. Finally, this whole scope creep experience highlighted for me that I am actually a much happier evaluator doing shorter, deep dive projects rather than long ones. This was a revelation. So, and actually I think it's crucially important for all of us to understand the conditions under which we as individuals or teams work best. It's equally true if you're an internal evaluator. When we can convey that clearly to clients or managers and gear our projects to align with those parameters, we end up with much happier clients and employees as well as much happier selves. So as with the other projects, at the end of my chapter in the book, I've included a few questions that you can use to reflect on the chapter or discuss it with colleagues or students. So thinking about safeguards that could be put in place, both the ones that I mentioned and other ideas that you might have, what could be done on the evaluator side, what kind of things could be done on the client organization side, and then how to deal with a train wreck if you see it starting to happen. Well, you've now heard the sorry tales of 3 epic facepalm moments. So how about you guys? Let's see your answers to this poll.
Yeah, we should have a poll coming up on the screen in front of you. Yep, looks like it's up now. Once again, just want to thank our presenters. Thank you so much, the 3 of you, for your vulnerability and sharing today. Okay, Olivia, I think we can go ahead and close that out. What do we have here? We've got some honesty here.
That's great to see.
Well, to be expected. Who among us hasn't had some sort of failure in the past? All right, folks. While we're getting set up here for Q&A, let me just pull my slideshow up.
So while you're doing that, Susanna, I know that you're going to ask me about were there any kind of themes that came up across the 22 stories in the books, and there definitely were. I was just kind of going through the conclusions this morning. So if I had to summarize some of the common issues that were coming up for folks, definitely engaging stakeholders was like probably almost number 1. And this took several forms of people kind of just neglecting to include somebody, but there was also cross-cultural issues or balancing the desires of one stakeholder with another. Another common problem that would come up are changes in scope of the evaluation and grappling with that. And as Jane's story so aptly described, turnover in the project staff, key project staff, and the impact that that had. Also, several of the chapters mention the challenges of balancing your independence as an evaluator with also trying to be responsive to client needs or to the program's needs, and also similarly balancing the need to have kind of some form of plan for the evaluation up front, but also being very, very fluid with it. And I know some of you will go, well, we have developmental evaluation for that. But, you know, in reality, there's definitely programs where DE is not the most appropriate approach to use, and even Michael Quinn-Patton is one of the first people who will say, you know, it's not for everybody. And as Jane has so clearly noted to me, the procurement process of a lot of programs just, you know, they really discourage developmental. So in terms of the commonalities around the lessons that people came out of, and you guys feel free to jump in as well, engaging stakeholders, right? It comes up again. We need to really do a good job of this. And even when you think you're engaging stakeholders, you know, maybe you're not. Also, communication came up again and again and again in the lessons learned. And, you know, unfortunately, communication skills, and you know, there's a couple of reasons why we might want to have these really good communication skills, managing the expectations of the program for the evaluation, being able to troubleshoot problems properly, and also just building trusting relationships with the program. But these are a soft skill, and they're not always taught in the classroom. Context, as Benoit so aptly described, is a really important thing to be considered in an evaluation. And, you know, you can have the overall context of the program. One of our chapters, Isaac Castillo, experienced that there's a local context within a larger context. And another chapter, Lisa O'Reilly's, talks about the context in terms of what's the motivation of the organization asking for the evaluation. Other themes, just small themes, just learning to expect the unexpected, as Jane talked about. Trusting your instincts. Several evaluators said, you know, I just really wished I'd trusted my instincts. I'd listened to those alarm bells. And then mentors, using mentors when you need to. But I think overall the takeaway, the key takeaway is have a reflective practice so that you can kind of review these, learn from your failures, or at least kind of start to manage them when they're minor before they blow up. Have I got that, Jane? Benoit, is there anything you would like to add?
I will add one point, because there's one chapter that struck a chord with me, and it's taking care of yourself as a person. Not only taking care of yourself as an evaluator, not only making sure that you're the best evaluator you can be, but also make sure that you think of yourself, not only others and stakeholders, and not only the job that you have, but also that you have to be able to live through it, to survive it. And in some of those chapters, one in particular, you know, some of the feelings that were expressed were quite intense. So not in my chapter, because, you know, I'm the Spock guy. I'm the one who doesn't listen to himself, and that's okay. But this is an important portion of the takeaway that I have from reading all these chapters.
Yeah. So I know we're kind of short for time, so what I thought I might do is just pick one question from each of the case studies and then pick some of the more general questions. So Benoit, Kanyar is asking about the importance of being willing to apply different methodologies, and how do you break down the wall between a qualitative and a quantitative practitioner, or even a client, you know, being able to appreciate those methods?
Extremely, very difficult. I mean, I described that I had 25 years of experience as a purely quantitative evaluator myself, and it took that failure of mine to actually open my mind to the fact that there are other sources of evidence, there are other types of evidence. It's relatively difficult to do it on yourself. It's even tougher when you have to convince somebody else that it's that this is important, and that there things to learn. Some cultures, organizational cultures, simply are not amenable to some types of evidence. I've worked in Canadian departments, science-based Canadian departments, where qualitative evidence has very little value in the eyes of the managers, and conversely in other organizations still in the same government where quantitative data was frowned upon. So there has to be a match between the organization and the questions and the methods and the evaluator themselves. That you can't put a round peg in a square hole that way. But the evaluator has to be a teacher as well, and to be convinced themselves that there's value in all types of evidence, and that the best results come from the amalgamation of all of these sources.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Benoit. I'm going to move now to a question from Ellen, and Ellen is asking Jane if you could give an example of how to build in scope creep checkpoints.
Kind of along the lines of, you know, like when you're thinking about the timeline for the evaluation, you just have explicit points where you are checking in with your key client contact, the project manager internal, and you're looking through, you know, what's going on here, what do we need next, but really explicitly looking at that question of how much is what we need to do now differing from what we initially agreed to at the outset, and to what extent do we need to adjust budget, timeline, or take some other task off the table in order to allow that thing to happen. I find quite often we have a problem where people are very keen to add things, and I want to be responsive and add those things that need to be added, but we do need to have a conversation about what are you going to take off my plate so I can do that, or are we going to adjust budget and timeline. You know, it's very like, you know, this is similar to when I look at a lot of organizations that are trying to achieve change in particular ways, particularly in organizations. They like to load change onto people, and it's a question I ask as an evaluator of the client. What are you going to take off these people's plates so that they can do what you're asking them to do? Because like loading people up, quite often, you know, workload issues are already a major source of stress. So if they're creating change that adds to that, that's something to ask. So it's kind of like walking the talk in your evaluation of what you're telling clients as well.
Yeah, and if I could just add to it, you know, I think that conversation with the client, or if you're an internal evaluator with your boss, I think that can be a difficult conversation to have. If you're an external evaluator, you don't want to come across as nickel and diming the client, and if you're internal, you don't want to look like a whiner. But yeah, it does have to happen, doesn't it?
Yeah, and they can, you know, they end up taking advantage of you, your good nature and your responsiveness, and you know, that's all right if it happens on a small, modest scale, but little pieces add up, as I kind of learned the hard way, and you know, it's still like people still try and do that to me, so it's hard.
And if I may add one point, Kylie, having the notion of checkpoints and assumes that there's something to check against. So that you have to have a good baseline agreement with the evaluation client as to what it is that the evaluator is expected to do, not only in terms of answering questions, I need answers to questions A, B, and C, but also how this is going to get done. Mm-hmm. And the clearer the initial contract, really, that within in an internal contract or an external contract, the clearer the contract at the outset, the easier the discussion is afterwards. But I've seen many a circumstance where that initial contract is not that clear, and that, well, it was a nice, good relationship at the beginning, and things were going smoothly until they didn't.
Mm-hmm. You know, picking up on something you had in your presentation, Jane, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a mentor, whether it's somebody in the evaluation field or if it feels safer to have somebody outside of the field. So for many years, my mentor was an evaluator called Mary Lee Stevenson. She's retired now here in Vancouver. But when I had a sticky situation, I would call her, and I'd be at the ready with my pen and paper scribbling down what she said because she was so articulate. Nowadays, my husband is a consultant as well, and there's a lot of times when I just use him to bounce ideas. The client wants this, it's over budget, what should I do? It's just, don't struggle with these things yourself. So there was a question, I deleted it by mistake, but I remember it, and it was about the system map that I was doing, and this idea of it's the process and not the product. So the question was, are there any other aspects of the evaluation process where this lesson might apply? And I would say absolutely. It's pretty rare for me to develop a logic model without having participation from the people who are at the center of that logic model, and in addition to the staff or whatever. And then, of course, the data party, which is becoming more and more common these days as well. So for those of you who might not be aware of a data party, this is the step in between doing your first analysis of the data and writing the final report and convening a meeting with those key stakeholders and going through the data together to determine how they would interpret it and what might be their recommendations, etc. So yeah, I hope that answered that question. Is there anything you want to add, Benoit and Jane, while I just pull us up another question?
I was going to actually add to the question you asked Benoit right at the beginning about the qualitative and the quantitative. I run into two recent evaluations where a very central stakeholder had very strong views about either methodology and what was the gold standard, or about evaluation itself. And I've run into two situations where an important stakeholder didn't actually think evaluation was a thing. I had one stakeholder say, oh, I can't believe that you can do a master's or a PhD in evaluation. I mean, what is that? Evaluation of what? So I'm like, well, gee, you just hired me to do an evaluation, and I put together the world's first fully interdisciplinary PhD in evaluation, and one of the guys I'm working with was one of the graduates of that program. So you're saying we have a qualification based on thin air? I mean, it was really a bizarre. So yeah, that teaching role, I mean, a lot of it is about just explaining to people what the heck evaluation is and isn't, and the diversity of methods and tools and perspectives that we can bring to bear. And I mean, that's, I think, one of the real value in our roles is blending all that good stuff to come up with something that really delivers what the client needs. So
I have another question for you too, and I know the person asking this question, and I know their situation, and it's a challenging one. So it says, how do you balance engaging stakeholders who might have very busy schedules? Also, how do you navigate, facilitate consensus building, and what are the consequences of not being able to achieve consensus building to the evaluator? Have you ever kind of experienced that? We've lost Benoit, but I'm sure he's there.
Yeah, we just lost his webcam, I don't know. But yeah, so I think one lesson that I have learned along the way about engaging stakeholders, and I was having a very interesting discussion about this at the last AEA conference where I did a section on use and influence, is when I first started understanding what collaborative participatory evaluation models are all about, it kind of sounded like you would have a group of stakeholders that you would bring with you through the entire evaluation. And what I encountered when I got into the real world was people don't have time for that. And it's not that, oh dear, they're disinterested, therefore they don't want to engage. It's literally they don't have time for it. So, and I was being unrealistic and expecting them to have time for it. So I think one place to start is think very, very carefully about who to involve in which pieces of the evaluation and why you want them there, and not just thinking about it from your perspective as the evaluator designing this perfect evaluation, but thinking it from the perspective of the stakeholders that you're trying to involve, and saying what is going to be the most the place where they can add the most value, where they're going to have the most fun, where it's really going to be meaningful for them, and they want and need to have a voice, or they have a right to have a voice. And basically trying to be maximally respectful of people's time so that I'm putting them in the place where they're going to add the most value and have the most fun. I'm also very careful about who I'm putting in the room together to try and get consensus, because sometimes there are power differences and personality differences in among the various subgroups or individuals, where in actual fact it can be too messy to try and get them to agree with each other, and I'm actually better to engage with these different stakeholders and make sure that I hear them, and then I do some synthesis and come back, and that way I'm actually taking the burden of conflict off them. So I'm doing this, and I'm kind of the bad guy doing this, saying like, well, we've got this and we've got this, and here's where I see the alignment, rather than trying to get them to slug it out in the room, because they have to go away and then work with each other again, whereas I don't. So I am less at risk of damaging a relationship internally for somebody I have to work with for the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. It's a tough one.
Thanks, Jane. So I'm conscious of the time, and I want to just give Suzanne a minute for wrapping up. Benoit, maybe in 2 minutes, can you quickly answer the question, what do you mean by, this is from Giselle, what do you mean by logic models limiting us as evaluators? Really briefly.
Oh yeah, well, logic models are 40 years old, maybe more, and they're focused on the program action. How does the inputs line up with the activities, with the outputs and the outcomes? But it's all centered around the program action. And logic models, at least the way I would taught them and the way I've used them for decades, simply do not recognize that this chain of reactions occur in a context, that there are forces active around this logic, and that there's many ways that this logic can be derailed, but also many ways in which the environment allow this series of chain reactions to occur. And this is absent from the logic model. Another better way to look at how a program exists and behaves and impacts is of course a theory of change. But even there ought to be more, and the more is to totally transpose the perspective, and instead of putting the program at the center, to put the issue, the social issue at the center, and to put the program as one of the many forces that affect the situation or the nature of that and extent of that problem. That's the short answer, but there's ways around that. There's ways to improve on the logic model. Just remember the logic model is itself very limited and limits ourselves in the way that we think about the intervention.
Thanks, Benoit. So maybe Suzanne, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're at time today. But again, I want to thank our 3 presenters here, Kylie Hutchinson, Jane Davidson, and Benoit Gauthier, for their participation today. This was a really fascinating talk. And thank you all also to our audience members who asked all of these great questions throughout the webinar. Now, we just want to let you know that if you are interested in purchasing the book that we've been talking about today, Evaluation Failures, 22 Tales of Mistakes Made and Lessons Learned, you can do so on sagepub.com and use the promo code FAIL to get a discount. That discount code is going to be good through the end of the month, through November 30th. So thank you again, everybody who joined us today, and special thank you to our presenters. And thanks also to our behind-the-scenes team that helped run the webinar. Please be on the lookout for an email from us that will include a recording of today's webinar in case you want to refer back to it. Please stay connected with us for information on upcoming webinars, and follow us on Twitter at @sage_methods. Thanks so much, everybody. We appreciate you being here with us today. Have a great rest of your day.